Okay, everybody, welcome everyone to Sunday mornings at the Marxist Library, a weekly program of the Institute for the Critical Study of Society. In pre-pandemic times, our programs were held at the Nebo Proctor Marxist Library located in Oakland, California, USA. During the pandemic, and likely afterwards, if the pandemic ever ends, we meet digitally on Zoom, but we still solicit donations to support the work of the Marxist Library. In fact, we should be wishing you a good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, because we now have attendees from throughout the United States and, in fact, from around the world. My name is Alan Miller, and I will be hosting this meeting. I'm a member of the program committee that organizes Sunday mornings at the Marxist Library. And I would like to start off by saying that we always welcome input, feedback, suggestions for topics and speakers. You can contact us through our website at ICSSMarx.org. A quick note, this session is being recorded and will be posted on YouTube, along with the link to it from our website at ICSSMarx.org, a couple of days after today's session. You can find the links to past programs also on our site. For over a decade and a half, Sunday mornings of the Marxist Library programs, we have been a platform for diverse presentations on topics such as political economy, capitalism, socialism, communism, imperialism, militarism, and war. Sunday mornings is a comradely forum for political discourse and debate. The opinions expressed are those of the participants and do not necessarily represent those of the ICSS or the Marxist Library. What we are united on is our respect for the work of Karl Marx and the belief that his work remains relevant today. Our motto is taken from Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. Our speaker today is Michael Gilbert, who is speaking to us from Boston. Not Boston, Massachusetts, but Boston, Lincolnshire in the United Kingdom. Michael studied modern philosophy and political economy at the Polytechnic of North London and social work law and social policy at the University of East Anglia in Norwich. Before embarking on his studies in his late teens, Mike was affiliated with a branch of the International Communist Party. He was also involved in an unemployed workers group and a group of libertarians. Michael became disillusioned with the British left for its sectarianism, its elitism, and what he saw as a complete disregard for the working class, seeing the role of the state as controlling the working class as opposed to the working class controlling the state. He decided to put his past learning to some use and began to study classical Marxism again. His hope is to unite all working people. His efforts have resulted in the publication of 4 booklets aimed at introducing the work of working people to Marxism, as well as creating a political group called Blue Revolution. Links to his booklets, by the way, are on today's program at our site. Michael will be talking today on Marx versus Lenin, the character of Marxism and the nature of the Blue Revolution. A quick note for how this session will be conducted. Our speaker will have about an hour for his presentation, during which time attendees will be muted. If you need anything, you can always communicate with everyone or anyone using the Zoom chat, which you can open by clicking on the chat icon at the bottom of your screen. After the presentation, we'll have a short break for announcements, followed by an hour of Q&A, questions and answers, moderated by myself. If you have a question or comment during the Q&A, raise your hand in the participants window, and we will call you in order. You will have 2 minutes for your question and comment. Please be respectful of the group, the speaker, and the moderator. Finally, after the Q&A, we will open up for general discussion. And with that, I'll turn it over to our speaker today, Michael Gilbert. Michael, if you'll share your screen, we can proceed. Thank you, Michael. Warm welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm just trying to get this sorted out. Here we are. Okay. Is that good for everybody?
Looks good. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So I didn't realize I was going to be speaking specifically about Marx and Lenin, but I'm happy to do that. But certainly what I want to talk about is the character of Marxism and the nature of Blue Revolution, and how I believe that the two ideas, Marx's ideas and those of Blue Revolution, can dovetail together for the benefit of ordinary working people, many of whom have become completely disillusioned with politics and worryingly ambivalent about Western democracy, and that gives me grave concern. Why can't I move these on? Can't seem to move the slides on. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. The issue is on PowerPoint. Sometimes it grabs control of the screen. You have to make the window that has PowerPoint your focus when you share.
Right. Okay. So I've got people's faces in front of me. Can I move that out? Move those out of the way. That's it.
We see
okay.
So
that's lovely. So essentially, classical Marxism, as defined by myself, is essentially the work of Karl Marx and Frederick Engels. Other thinkers include Lenin, Trotsky, and others, but I tend to sort of stick very specifically to the work of Marx and Lenin in an undiluted way. They left a lot of information behind in numerous volumes, but weren't very specific about a number of things which have become sort of slogans of the left, if you like, and things like the withering away of the state, the nature of the Communist Party, and then the workers' state, the dictatorship of the proletariat, and the notion of consciousness, class consciousness and workers' consciousness. And as a result of this, I think there's been some serious areas for ambiguity to creep into what these various sort of themes and characteristics mean. And in many ways that they've tended to sort of overwrite, if you like, what Marx and Engels actually meant. And a number of individuals have come to prominence who offer the just society. But in doing that, they're actually sort of promoting interests other than those of the working class. So having spent, in my early 20s, spent some time in London and having observed what was going on the left back in those days, I decided that left-wing politics was sort of starting to eat itself. And I sort of abandoned really all interest and sort of studied Marx, but didn't study Marx in a particularly political way. I wasn't politically involved at that time. A number of years later, 2 divorces, 5 children, I decided that it was time perhaps to get back into Marxism again, because I was becoming more and more concerned, as I say, about the state of the world and the fact that there was so much going on and nobody seemed capable of explaining it. And my knowledge of Marxism, I felt, might actually make a contribution to debates around a whole variety of different things. So why do we need to reconsider the thoughts of Karl Marx and Frederick Engels? Well, fundamentally, as I've said, the world is a very, very complicated place. Very few people are capable of understanding it. And whereas in the days of the bourgeois establishment, the full bourgeois hegemony, there was a lot of confidence around about how to deal with the world, rightly or wrongly, and in most cases wrongly. The world has moved into a different phase now, and it's a very, very complicated place. We have no real narrative, in my opinion, for dealing with different cultures and religions, many of which challenge our understanding of what's right and wrong. We've got Western economies that are now reliant on the adrenaline of debt, with nobody seeming to feel that there's anything wrong with that, given that the debt that's being acquired by our political leaders is debt that's actually owned by the nation and therefore owned by working people. But it seems to be continuing to make certain individuals very wealthy at the expense of people. In many ways, I tend to think that this is a worse form of exploitation than the exploitation that Marx highlighted in the 1840s, where people were being exploited with low wages and having created a lot of value for the bourgeois class. But today, our political class are just running up enormous amounts of debt. And that seems to me to be an incredibly unfair situation. We've got climate change, artificial intelligence and globalization, and they're a threat to working people everywhere. We have to think about what working people will be doing when we have artificial intelligence taking away numerous jobs, including lorry driving and various other jobs of that sort. And climate change, we can't continue to expect everybody to come up to the standards of the 1970s, 80s Western world. To expect the rest of the world to come up to those standards will unfortunately put an incredible burden on the planet. So there's a need to start thinking about how that sort of works. There's no narrative which can unite people of all ages, cultures and nations without looking again at the work of Karl Marx and Frederick Engels. Their notion of dialectical materialism speaks to all cultures. It may be an uncomfortable conversation to have, but it does explain, their theories do explain a lot about why certain cultures remain the way they are and aren't able to progress. And finally, I think people are fearful, stressed and anxious about and that includes people who you might typically identify as being on the left. But when you watch YouTube or Facebook, you see QAnon and people like that, people who you might identify as being more on the right, those people are just as fearful, stressed and anxious about their lives as well. And by and large, they all come from the same class that I'm describing. They come from the Western working class. So Karl Marx and Frederick Engels, we have a sort of a challenge, I think. I don't know whether it's the same in your part of the world, but over here, the word Marxism gets used as a sort of a slang word, a portmanteau term for everything that's ghastly about politics and the left in general. So it's an easy sort of slogan to band around. Oh, it's just the Marxists and Marxist this and Marxist that. And unfortunately, that's tarnished the name of a really important philosopher, an economist and radical thinker, because I don't personally think that Marx deserves that kind of treatment. But unfortunately, that is precisely how Marxism is treated. The reason I think that we have this association between Karl Marx and some of these negative ideas is, of course, the only two revolutions that we've really had, which are described as Marxist revolutions, were bloody revolutions. I mean, the French Revolution was also a Marxist revolution. It ushered in the bourgeois state, but in more recent times, we've had, of course, Russia and China. Both revolutions were very bloody and both sort of failed, in my opinion, to deliver benefits to the ordinary rank and file Russian and Chinese worker. We have the suggestion by our exploiting classes that that Marxism is about violent overthrow of capitalism. There's nothing violent necessarily in Marxism. Marx very occasionally uses sort of violent language, but I don't think Marx's theories are in themselves a call to arms. I think a violent call to arms. We had our bourgeois revolution in the 17th century in this country. It was called the Glorious Revolution, and effectively it involved one monarch being replaced by another two. And there was no real bloodshed involved at all, though we did, of course, previously have our civil war. Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin and Mao are three very, very significant figures on the left and in Marxism. But to what extent those four individuals represent Marx, it's not, to my mind, that clear. In fact, I would suggest that the later Trotsky, the Trotsky in exile, probably returned to something which is close to classical Marxism. Lenin, I think, sold out the workers in trying to pursue his grand vision, and of course Stalin and Mao were on a path to industrialize and compete with the West, which of course threw up all kinds of economic and social challenges, including the annihilation of large groups of their native people. Communism, bandied around as a term associated with Marx. Marx never actually defined communism. We will, as we progress through this presentation, touch on some of the hints and suggestions that he made as to what communism might actually look like, but he was very clear he didn't want to nail it. And I think the reason for that was that he realized that, this was supposed to come from the collective view of the mass of working people, and not from a mid-Victorian thinker, an academic. And so he sort of avoided sort of giving too much definition as what communism was. He saw it as a kind of a continual revolution, a continual refreshing of society as new science was introduced and as new techniques for production were identified. Class, again, big issue, and quite rightly so. Marx is associated with class. It's not necessarily always seen as a positive thing, but he is definitely somebody who considers class to be the fundamental element in the disadvantage that's faced by the vast majority, 90% of the working population. All property is theft. It wasn't actually Marx who said that. It was Proudhon, but nonetheless, it's a slogan that people use against Marxists. The idea that Marxists will simply come along and whatever you've got, they'll take it. And there's lots of tropes, as we know, around that sort of thing, both in this country, and I'm sure it's the same where you are. And enforced equality, a sort of ant's nest equality where everyone's forced to be exactly the same like drones. That isn't something which Marx refers to in any of his writing. This is sort of enforced equality from each according to their ability to each according to their needs does not suggest that everyone is absolutely the same. And of course, finally, as a result of the revolutions in Russia and China and in other parts of the world as well, North Korea, we have dictatorships which are associated regrettably with the work of Karl Marx and Frederick Engels. So we have some challenges, those of us who are Marxists and want to promote Marxism for ordinary working people. So we need to sort of recontextualize, I think. We need to sort of go back to basics and sort of look at, put all that stuff that I've just talked about to one side. And go back and look at what actual classical Marxism is, laying some of these ghosts to rest. I mean, it's not to say we should deny what's happened in places like Russia and China, but just put it into a slightly more mature context. So classical Marxism, as I'm sure you're aware, sprang from three strands of thought: materialism, idealism, and classical economics. Marx fused them together and created dialectical materialism, the idea that the lived reality and the economic circumstances that people experience gives rise to their consciousness and gives rise to changes being introduced as society evolves on a sort of a pattern. I think he used the phrase sort of like a syllogism, that society emerges on the basis of a tension between the past and the present, creating, if you like, a new future. And the labour theory of value, absolutely fundamental to Marxism and fundamental to Blue Revolution in many respects. I think it's the one thing that's been abandoned over the last 50 or 60 years, the labour theory of value, but it's something I do consider to be very, very important for the benefit of ordinary working people, actually having a way of valuing what working people do in a world where really value is the price that someone's prepared to pay for something. So the key works which I've sort of used to sort of put these ideas together, obviously Das Kapital, the study of how wage labour is turned into capital, which becomes wealth controlled by the bourgeoisie. And in this text, Marx talks about dialectics for the first time. The origin of the family, private property and the state. This explores the evolution of society from the tribe to the bourgeois nation state. It's a very influential book as far as I'm concerned, because it explains quite a lot about why different societies are as they are. It gives you an opportunity not necessarily to judge other societies in a negative way, but just to sort of contextualize them in terms of their state of economic and social development. Not everybody in the world has been through a bourgeois revolution as we have in the West. Value, price and profit. This explains how these economic factors interplay to drive wages down. The Manifesto of the Communist Party, 1848, is much quoted, for the many, not the few. It's a slogan of our Labour Party in this country, but I think it tends to be little read and little understood. In the manifesto, Marx talks about different kinds of socialism and makes the point that there are a number of socialisms there's not all of those socialisms are Marxist socialism. And what I'd like to think is that with Blue Revolution, I'm nearing something which perhaps if Marx if he was here, would probably recognise as being closer to sort of Marxist socialism than anything that's maybe around at the moment. The critique of the Gotha programme, this is where one of those famous slogans comes from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. It's often accepted as a way of identifying what communism might actually look like, but it's very vague. It doesn't really go into a lot of detail. It doesn't exactly say how that process is to be delivered. Critique of political economy creates the notion of, or describes the notion of consciousness. Consciousness is really important in Marxism. Class consciousness is particularly important. And I think class consciousness, the recognition that all working people are from basically the same sort of economic and social background. There may be minor differences between them, but essentially their relationship with capital, or indeed, as I've said earlier on, their relationship with debt is pretty much the same across the piece. So the vast majority of people really ought to share the same consciousness about the system as it's working to their disadvantage at the moment. The German ideology, this is another hint at what communism might look like. In this, Marx describes hunting, fishing, herding, and critiquing. He's talking really about different stages of human evolution, the evolution of consciousness, hunting being a very primitive form of consciousness, fishing and herding being an advance on mere hunting, and of course critiquing being an advanced way of society ordering itself. Again, in response to Bruno Bauer, consciousness is described again in this document. It's a very interesting document, actually, because in it, Marx describes various religions as capturing various stages in humanity, in the development of human consciousness, which he describes we shed like a snakeskin. And I like that analogy. I like the idea that, you know, humanity goes through various stages of consciousness, evolving from one to the next, and they shed the old one off like a snakeskin. It's sort of it's a nice illustration of what he's trying to explain. Socialism, utopian and scientific, the forces of history, and economic and philosophical manuscripts. This is where there's reference to the riddle of history. One of my pamphlets is called Solving the Riddle of History, simplified, and I hope I do justice to the canon of Marx's work on this subject in my 7,000 word pamphlet. I'd say it's probably definitely worth a read if you haven't already read it. Okay, so Marx and Engels created a theory known as scientific socialism, otherwise known as dialectical materialism. A fundamental aspect of this principle is that we have what's called our unique species essence. All animals have species essence. All animals' species essence differs. Our species essence is characterized by our ability to plan and communicate, and to have memories of the past and to project ourselves forward into the future. Most animals, well, all animals apart from ourselves, are really on the planet to reproduce. We are on the planet to cooperate for the benefit of protecting and promoting our species, humans. Consciousness is a unique human characteristic, so other animals don't have consciousness to the same extent we do. Class consciousness is vital, as I've said. Class consciousness defines the ability of all workers to see something in common about themselves, and to recognise that they are in the same way treated disadvantageously by what became the bourgeois system in the mid-19th century. Labour power, I've referred to it earlier on. Labour power and how it is used tends to reflect the stage at which human consciousness has evolved. So if you go back to the tribal period, labour power was pretty much shared evenly amongst various groups within a tribe. Yes, there was differentiation on the basis of sex, but within the male and the female group, there was very little differentiation. And whatever resources were brought back by the tribe to the tribe, they were shared reasonably evenly. There was no inequality or exploitation taking place back in those days. However, once we learned to fish and herd, as I've just referred to earlier on, we started to create surpluses, and it's those surpluses which gave rise to power, and gave rise to the political class So the first political class, of course, would have been kings, and they would have made sure that whatever surpluses were produced went to them before they went to everybody else. So this idea of labour power and how people's labour power is exploited determines what kind of society someone is living in. In our society, in Marxist society in the 1840s, 1848, whatever, the labour power was exploited by the use of a wage. A free worker would contract their labour power to an employer, but the employer would make much more value and create capital out of that labourer's labour power. Bourgeois politics and economics. So when we left feudalism, critical point in the history and the evolution of capitalism, we left feudalism. The feudal class didn't like the bourgeoisie didn't like feudalism. It was holding them back. They established class consciousness amongst their own group, amongst the bourgeoisie, and eventually they established some basic legal principles, which I've summarised as contract, choice, and consent. Those three terms don't appear together in anything that Marx has written, but I've sort of synthesised them because I think it's important that we recognise, using this diametric, the dialectic process, that the bourgeois class created something very revolutionary when they created the concepts of contract, choice, and consent. Prior to the bourgeois class, contract, choice, and consent just didn't exist, and for many people in other cultures in the world, those principles still don't exist. So exploitation, I think I've explained what that looks like. That's the process by which labour power is taken advantage of. Somebody might work 6 hours and might actually sort of create enough wealth to cover their wages, but then the capitalist makes them work for a further 6 hours, and whatever is worked in that second 6 hours is the exploitation that's taking place between the bourgeoisie employer and the worker who's contracted to sell his labour power. Labour power is essentially a commodity. Both Marx and Engels believe that material circumstances create the collective consciousness of society, not abstract ideas like God. This comes from the critique of political economy. And essentially what it means is that there's no end in sight yet for history, because although the Western world may have reached a certain point, it doesn't foreshadow that there is an end to history anywhere in sight. The rest of the world, to some extent, has to catch up with us in terms of perhaps identifying contract, choice, consent as principles that they would like to contribute to the governance of their lives. But on the other hand, we've also got some way to go before our society is as fair and just as it should be. Right, okay, so I've talked about humanity and its species essence. So a spider labours, but that doesn't labour as we do. We labour with consciousness. Our material reality, how we live, what we do and how we do it, defines our consciousness. It's not the other way around. So if you look at when Marx was writing in the mid-Victorian period, the world that people lived in then was very different from the world that we live in now. I mean, there are some parallels, but they're not absolute. They're not absolutely the same. Back in those days, workers were very badly treated. They were impoverished. And often failure of the capitalist system resulted in starvation. The contract, choice, and consent principle didn't really have any moral backing. It was just a set of legal rules that were applied by the bourgeois state to ensure that capitalism survived. So labour power is what workers sell or have taken from them. So a slave would have his labour power taken from him or her. Labour power under a bourgeois system is traded. It's consented to. You sell it to an employer under a contract of employment. I think we've probably touched on that. Once humanity's collective ingenuity created revolutions, surplus was created and the three ages of exploitation began. So slave society gave way to feudalism and then finally capitalism. It's interesting, actually. I think I've read an article somewhere from some anthropologists that said once we left our tribal societies, humanity began to shrink in size and stature. And that's, of course, because exploitation crept in. And whereas before, what was divvied out by the tribe gave everybody a fair amount of food and resources, once we moved into the ages of exploitation, slave society, then certain people got more than others, and some people got practically nothing. So, as I said, each of these different phases created a unique consciousness different from the others, and each had contradictions. And again, contradictions is an important term in Marxism. It's where the existing order, the existing hegemony, if you like, starts to buffer up against people who are very keen to see some kind of change or some sort of evolution or development in society. So the feudal system was challenged by a bourgeois class, a class of people who didn't like the idea of just being told what to do by a feudal overlord. So you have this idea of thesis, or the hegemony. You then have the antithesis, the opposite to that, and out of that you have synthesis. And that's the sort of new order that will eventually become the new thesis, prior to, hopefully, the whole situation being challenged all over again. The idea of a permanent revolution is essentially that process just rolling along in historical terms. It's not about violence on the streets perpetually. So the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, when capitalism was established, they rejected feudalism's natural authority and God-ordained power for the aristocracy and the king. They challenged the greedy authoritarian Catholic Church. They created a bourgeoisie, or free wealthy men. I mean, there's no reason why women couldn't be bourgeoisie either. And there's nothing prohibiting women becoming capitalists even back then. Capitalism was essentially contract, choice and consent, and as long as you could find a way of exploiting somebody, you could join the ranks of the capitalists. So they demanded rights to acquire and control that self-made wealth. That self-made really should be in inverted commas, and the reason is, of course, it wasn't self-made. They didn't make the wealth. They exploited the workers to make the wealth, using this device of a contract of employment, the purchase of someone's labor power. In Boston, we were members of what's called a Hanseatic League. That was a league of traders across Europe, from the Baltic and into sort of Russia, and they were very, very early examples of bourgeoisie. So the bourgeoisie undermined the aristocracy, simple as that. They also found that the religion of Catholicism rubbed up against the new ideology, the new ideology of the bourgeoisie. So interestingly, a new religion, a new denomination was created, which fitted much better in with the new world order, the new emerging order of small business people, traders, manufacturers, and of course that's Protestantism and the Reformation. As it evolved, of course, because we've talked about how you bring things in, you get this thesis, this antithesis, and this synthesis. The synthesis of capitalism, of course, ensured that old-fashioned ideas like inequality, elitism, and unfairness, which were inherent within the feudal system, became part of the capitalist system as well. So whilst the radical bourgeoisie created modern ideas of contract, choice, and consent, there was also the tendency for them to take advantage of older systems of power and take advantage of unfairness, inequality, and elitism. So it was a kind of mixed bag, really. I mean, your early worker within the capitalist system would have experienced a lot of uncertainty. They would have lost all the certainty associated with the Catholic Church and associated with the feudal system, but they'd have gained nothing in terms of in terms of their sort of economic and social position. They'd have been no better off than they were previously. So stuff had been taken away, and contract, choice, consent may have been given to them, but hey, these are abstract ideas that don't have any actual morality backing them up. So Marx's view of capitalism, well, controversially, Marx is often referred to as somebody who hates capitalism and wanted to see it burst asunder, which is true, he did, but he also saw capitalism as a necessary and essential stage of history. He opposed the rural idiocy desired by some, which was basically holding people back into a feudal world where they just worked the land, tilled the crops, and give the proceeds of their labor to their overlords. He didn't like capitalism because he didn't like the fact that it continued to perpetuate unfairness, inequality, and elitism. However, he saw that we had to go through this stage if we were to emerge beyond that with something that resembles socialism or indeed communism. So like feudalism was burst asunder because of contradictions in capital, because of its contradictions. So capitalism would eventually be burst asunder due to contradictions causing revolution by the working class. There are many contradictions in capitalism, but the fundamental one is that the wealth created by the worker isn't actually controlled by the worker. It just contributes towards capital accumulation, and it obviously makes the bourgeois class incredibly rich and incredibly powerful. So that's the fundamental contradiction in capitalism, according to Marx. The working class created the profit that empowered and enriched the bourgeoisie. This was the justification for a workers' revolution. Workers had to get class consciousness first. They had to realize they shared this position as the exploited class, taken advantage of by the bourgeois exploiting classes. Okay, so whilst workers were free under bourgeois principles of contract choice consent, they were poor, ill-educated, had poor health, and had no collective voice politically or economically. So capitalism was a pretty bad thing, although it did gift to the world contract choice consent, freedom, and democracy, which we extended to more and more ordinary people to date. So Marxist revolutions have both created feudalism and had destroyed feudalism. I say Marxist revolutions because these sort of bourgeois revolutions do follow the sort of traditional pattern of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, in the sense that there was contradictions identified, and a particular class came into existence that shared a consciousness and decided that it needed to change things, and then moved to the state of revolution and change things. So the bourgeois class consciousness was becoming aware of the contradictions like the power of the state and the Catholic Church, etc. Yeah, I think I've probably covered that. Yeah. So the legacy of Karl Marx, well, sadly, from my perspective anyway, I'm sure that as part of our debate we may have an opportunity to talk about this, but I don't consider the revolutions in Russia and China were Marxist revolutions, but they were revolutions. They were revolutions that ushered into existence a single party state controlling the surplus value contributed to the state by the worker. So essentially you just stopped having it the value being taken under contract by a member of the bourgeoisie, by a member of the exploiting class, but you had the state stepping in and doing exactly the same thing. So the reality for the worker was pretty similar under Bolshevism to under capitalism. Obviously, Bolshevism would be better because you were largely being supplied with resources and a job. Capitalism in its early iterations was a brutal place, where if you didn't comply with the rules of contract choice consent, you'd end up on the end of a gallows. So essential was it to the bourgeois class to make sure that capitalism was really nailed down, and their consciousness became the consciousness of their state. So Marx's greatest legacy is his analysis of exploitation and alienation, which created workers' rights and the still limited democracy we enjoy today. And I'll come on to this idea of limited democracy. We do have a democracy, but I don't think it goes anywhere near as far as it could do in terms of empowering working people. And we have the situation in China. I don't know, China's an interesting country because Chinese workers, to me anyway, I don't know, seem to me to be the proletarians of the world. They are being exploited by their own state, but they're also being exploited by large global, Western global corporations. So as far as I'm concerned, Chinese workers are in the sort of place that at one time, our workers might have been in, although again, they are supplied with material resources. They don't have any freedom. So socialism has to reflect the maturing consciousness of the working class. If it doesn't, like Russia in 1917, it will turn on the people it claims to represent. So this notion of maturing consciousness is fundamental to Marxism, the idea that you have to have a class that's gaining this understanding of contract, choice, consent, the positive side of capitalism, but also recognizing that the unfairness, inequality, and elitism that needs to be driven out of the system. If you don't have that understanding, or you don't allow that understanding to become established, then you tend to have a situation as they found in Russia, where the Bolsheviks simply replicate the power structures of the Tsarist state. I mean, it's no surprise that that Lenin had, sort of palaces and Rolls Royces, which he took from the royal family. So in Marxist terms, I would argue Britain is a socialist country with progressive taxation, healthcare, welfare, pensions, and education, plus workers' rights upheld by the state. And then there's a but. Just try this button. But too much. There's still too much wage and wealth inequality, particularly amongst those in the political sphere. Marx didn't like the bourgeois wages system, but ordinary people seem to do so. The idea that the more value you add, the less wages you tend to receive, and the less value you add, the further up the food chain you are, the more the wages you tend to receive. That is a system that doesn't really work for me personally. It didn't work for Marx either. But on the whole, it's something we probably need to be challenging ordinary working people about, because they're paying a lot of money for people who aren't actually contributing much in the way of value. The anarchy of the economic system delivered wealth to all once upon a time, and I think Marx would be the first one to say that you've got to have a thriving capitalist system, because it's the thriving capitalist system that gives you the fundamentals of socialism and eventually communism. So you have to have that system in place, and it has to be delivering sufficient wealth to support everybody in a fair and even and equal way. We still, as we said earlier on, we've had the name of Marx tarnished by the exploiting class, and it's too easily associated with violence by the left. There's too little political power devolved to the workers who create the wealth or service the debt. Politicians hang on to power, and bourgeois systems allow them to do so. Too much power incentive to maintain. There's too much power incentivizing the maintenance of elitism and status within our political systems. No one's going to come along and suddenly say, we want to stop having these top-down political hierarchies. We want to sort of try and get power coming in from the base and get more control over the state. That isn't going to happen. The only way that will happen is if we get some kind of, revolution through the ballot box, and we can change people's consciousness and encourage them to think about the world and politics and their lives in a different way from the way they've been conditioned to see them. There's too little respect for contract, choice, and consent amongst those governing us. We don't really have choice or consent. Our politicians do what they like, and they do what they like when they want to do it. And Marx would say modern people, and I think this is what I would say. I sort of assume Marx might say the same thing if he were here, but I like to think that modern people have the consciousness for a new political and economic synthesis. But first we have to achieve an antithesis to the power of our elite. So we have to challenge the existing hegemonic structures and get people thinking about themselves politically and economically in a different way. So what we do with Blue Revolution, and Blue Revolution is a very interesting thing I'll hopefully mention in a little while, but we fuse the notion of species essence, the idea that basically everybody wants to cooperate. We go back to the day of the era of the tribe. We are quite capable of being collaborative and cooperative. The idea that we are greedy and self-interested is caused by the bourgeois system within which we operate. We are made to be that way. We're made to think about things in terms of status and power and unfairness, and it all seems common sense or normal, but it isn't. The concept of labour power is vitally important to me personally, because of course people doing things is really important. What people do has to be supported financially, and you know, we need to have decent wages paid and jobs created, and we need to encourage people to work in their own communities and to resource them to do that. There's lots of work out there that needs doing in society. There's just not a lot of employment. The evaluation of alienation and exploitation. We've moved to the point now where people don't necessarily have to be exploited and alienated. Exploitation is the process by which you are forced to give up your labour power for the benefit of somebody else. People today are quite capable of contracting away their labour power for the benefit of their community. And I think we need to sort of explore what that might look like, and how we might sort of go forward with this idea. I mean, I, for example, have been out today doing some sort of community work, doing some litter picking. I'm working on a few projects in the town, and I'm giving up my labour power freely to do that, because I'm able to do that. And I think we need to look at that process, and try and encourage our politicians and others to sort of think about how that can be promoted. So again, surplus value, capital accumulation. Lots of people talk about surplus value, capital accumulation, as though it was a kind of normal thing. It is the fundamental problem with capital and capitalism, the fact that we are continually making more and more and more. And I was reading in the Times today, somebody was talking about, you know, how great capitalism is and how capitalism's lifted people out of poverty. And yeah, it has done that. But on the other hand, you know, it's also at risk of destroying the planet, because the impulse is to acquire as much capital as possible, rather than to see the possibility of reducing the amount of capital that's acquired, or indeed not having any capital acquisition at all, and giving people more time within which they can fulfill their sort of aspirations, their personal aspirations. Bourgeois consciousness. So again, challenging these ideas that came with the bourgeois state, that unfairness, inequality and elitism are somehow normal. And then looking at raised consciousness, which is an understanding of contract, choice and consent. Collectively, I think that all those things could potentially give rise to some kind of revolution. And again, we're not talking about a violent revolution, we're talking about a change in perspective. We're talking about people collectively shifting the way they think about themselves and their societies, their communities, and their politics. So we want to end, you know, wage slavery, theories of surplus value. People were, when Marx spoke of wage slavery, he meant you were a slave to wages, not a wage slave. So we can end that process where people are in a sense paid to give up their labour power for something which isn't of any direct benefit to themselves. You know, they can work less and have more. We need to find a way of allocating from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, which is the critique of the Gotha programme. We need to try and work towards identifying the many, not the few, as being the recipients of this changed approach to politics and economics. And we need to identify what the dictatorship of the proletariat looks like. I think my own opinion is that it's something about the bottom of the base of society controlling or having more control over the top. And then the withering away of the bourgeois state. I think we need to start looking at how we can deliver something along those lines. How does that actually work? So, the nature of blue revolution. So this is how we could potentially, or I think we could potentially do it. Blue Revolution is not a party, but it's a political franchise. It's a brand or a concept, and it's free to use by anyone, anywhere. So the idea is that it doesn't have any controlling influences over people. It doesn't tell people how to vote or tell people how to think. It doesn't force people into arrangements where they've got to follow a party line. It's not an echo chamber for one particular perspective rather than another. It's something which just enables people to come together, perhaps as we're coming together today, to talk about what their lives look like and what things might make their lives better than they are currently. We've got top-down politics in the West. We've got bourgeois institutions. We need to somehow deal with those and change them, because while we continue to have power coming down from the top, we won't get heard at the base, and we need to find a way of getting ordinary people into politics, and Blue Revolution may or may not be one way of doing that. So the idea is you identify politicians who are independent of party-based power. Therefore, we are essentially a working class party. We're not looking at promoting ourselves or promoting the current system. You know, we're broad-minded enough to think that the system probably does have to change, and no, without necessarily having a specific agenda as to how it needs to change, we can do something to improve it. So it's an identity that doesn't fetter the people who choose to use it. You know, freedom is guaranteed. Round here, we have a big debate with the independents on Boston Borough Council, who seem to think that we marshal the thoughts of those people who identify themselves with Blue Revolution. It's nothing of the sort. I mean, essentially, if you were to get elected, and we haven't got anybody elected yet, if you were to be elected under the Blue Revolution banner, you wouldn't have to toe any particular party line. You could simply vote with your conscience in the way that it felt right for you to vote based on your personal lived experience. There's no membership, there's no internal party discipline, there's no selection or external control. You simply say that you want to be involved. The expectation is that you understand the principles of contract, choice and consent. We're not interested in people who want to be exercising undue influence or coercion or compulsion on anybody. And with no party allegiance, revolution is only possible when the existing order of society is understood and abandoned. And I think that's what the 4 pamphlets I've written are about. I've written a 5th one, which I'm still in the process of putting the finishing touches to. But it's about encouraging working people to understand the state, to understand why we are where we are now, where our values and beliefs come from, and which of them need to be challenged and changed, and which of them need to be left in place. So why do we need something like Blue Revolution? Well, I mean, it's a bit, we're not going to get anywhere even locally, but I mean, in terms of a sort of a more global perspective, something like Blue Revolution is needed because workers in other countries are governed by tribal, feudal and capitalist systems, which, as we've said, are all phases in humanity's evolution, which are exploitative. And they have a right to understand this about themselves as well. They have a right to understand how they're being exploited and be given opportunities to do something about that. You know, capitalism's mode of production, the free market is financed by debt, and it's just destroying the planet. I mean, we're in debt to the Chinese, yet we sort of criticize China. You know, I mean, the whole system isn't really working as it should do. There's lots of massive contradictions within it, and our political class don't really understand how to change it. Artificial intelligence will make people redundant. You know, could people become a threat to the elite system? Could we become, you know, surplus to requirements, shall we say? I mean, these are all potential threats going into the next millennium. I mean, they're not so much threats now, but they need to be considered for the future. And should people have a contract chosen and consented to a new settlement with the state? I don't think everything's okay. I think the Western world is in crisis, and I think ordinary people have a role in helping our political elites sort out the mess, because political parties do things in our name, but they do things without our consent. So the aftermath, if we did have something like Blue Revolution, some possible ideas: a widely understood knowledge of contract, choice, consent, and where it comes from. You know, global understanding that essentially this is the highlight, the pinnacle of what humanity can aspire to, and maybe going beyond that. But at this stage in our development, you know, what would be better than having a society where everybody was free, contract, choose and consent to how they live their lives without any power or prejudice coming from anywhere. Power over the state could be devolved to lower tier authorities. In this country, we have a thing called the House of Lords. I mean, I personally think the House of Lords is a complete anachronism. I don't know why we've still got it. But what we could do is abolish the House of Lords, and with the money that we save, we could then use locally elected lower tier authority members, councillors, to scrutinise everything that's going on at Westminster. Welfare should be used to allow people to alternate and switch employment, or indeed switch into doing something valuable for their local community, using their labour power freely. for the benefit of their local communities, getting away from this idea that you have to sort of sell your labour power to a capitalist to get paid. I mean, if you're adding value somehow, then adding value should be a good in itself. We need to bring planet-busting debt under control. I mean, that's only going to happen if ordinary people are part of the debate, because at the moment, all of our political elites seem quite keen to just carry on ratcheting up the debt. And it only takes a couple of blips in interest rates or something, or for housing to be included in our inflation figures. And I think the whole of the Western economies will start tumbling down. So we need to re-establish a concept of value. This notion of value has been lost. As I say, the value of something is now the price of it. We need to find a way of identifying the value of people's labour power, and identifying that pretty much everybody has broadly the same amount, hence the from each according to their ability to each according to their needs idea. There's nobody who should be earning the sort of salaries that a small country would be earning. On the other hand, it's not right for people to be living below the breadline and unable to feed their families. So this idea of value, how much people are entitled to have, how much value their labour power is worth within the context of their community, I think is an important part of creating a fairer and more just society. Political parties, as part of this, could be stripped of their manipulative power. I don't know what it's like in the States, but in this country, we have very manipulative party politics where people are whipped and told how to vote. And politicians, leading politicians, will talk to their junior members and advise them that if they want a ministerial job or they want to climb the greasy pole to power, then they need to sort of vote with the government rather than vote against them, or indeed vote against them if they happen to be the opposition. Taxation. It should be used to maintain and support jobs. Marx was what they call a neoclassical economist. He recognised that the problems with capitalism were that you went into regular bouts of depression, decline, and that's caused by a lack of demand. And so the whole idea of the revolution in Marxist terms is to ensure that demand for products is continuously there, so that workers are supported in their work, but without the need to sort of work 16 hours a day and earn a minuscule wage for doing it. And the party, as far as the revolution, so the party stops wielding power. There's no need for parties to wield power. Parties should be a way of passporting people into positions where they've got some influence. And I personally think that is the withering away of the state, when ordinary people become involved in politics, and when politicians are basically made up of ordinary people, all of whom are broadly the same, with broadly the same expectations and broadly the same level of income, then although there will be systems in place to ensure that things work as they should, the notion of a state separate from the individuals will, I think, diminish quite significantly. Okay, that's the presentation. I can't hear you.
Alan, we can't hear you.
Yeah, Alan, we can't hear you.
Strange talking to a screen and not being able to see anybody.
So Alan's trying to fix his sound system because we can't hear him. What we can do is people, there is a intermission here with the announcement.
I'm back on now, Raj.
Oh, okay, good.
Okay,
right.
Sorry about that.
Just in time.
Sorry about that. Okay. Thank you very much for a very comprehensive presentation, especially on the basics of Marxism. You touched on some really important, serious challenges that we're facing today. And I hope in our question and answer period, people will address those questions that you raised. Before we continue, I just want to take a quick break here and make a few announcements. Let me go ahead and change my screen here for a second. Oops. Okay. Hold on, please. We have some terrific upcoming programs. And I just want to announce them. Can you guys see my
Yes.
my screen now? Next week, we have a presentation on Korea, North and South Korea, in the context of the US military empire in the Asia Pacific. Our presenter is going to be Tim Shurock, who is an internationally known commentator on Korea. Tim was born and raised in East Asia, grew up in Japan and Korea, and is a frequent writer on publications on Korea and a member of the Korea Policy Institute's governing board. So he'll be talking about some of the changes that are taking place, how recent events in Afghanistan are going to affect the situation in Korea. Following that, the week after, we have Bahman Azad, Dr. Bahman Azad, who is the chair of the World Peace Council and a professor at a university on the East Coast. He'll be speaking about Afghanistan between two Cold Wars. Dr. Azad will be analyzing recent events, talking about what's happened in Afghanistan, what is going to happen, and the implications on the current political situation. You can find out more information about these presentations by going to our website at ICSSmarx.org. And when you do, you will get this sign up pop up where if you add your name and your email address, you will be placed on our mailing list and will receive automatically every week, as long as you wish, announcements about upcoming presentations. Also on our website are past presentations, including links to videos for many, if not most of them. So stay tuned on our website to find out more about what's going on. Another thing that you can see on our website is a place for you to donate to ICSS. If you wish to make a donation to ICSS or the hosting Marxist Library in Oakland, some of the information on how to do that is shown here on the Donate to ICSS page on the website. I think that that is everything that, as far as announcements go. Anybody else has anything to say, please speak up on that. What I'd like to do from here is to transition over to our question and answer period. And as many of you know, we do question and answer period for about an hour. The way to express your desire to raise a question or make a comment is to raise your hand on the participants window, or if you have a newer version of Zoom, to use the reactions dialog, which you can, there's a little button at the lower right-hand side of your window if you bring the mouse pointer down there. And we will call on people in the order in which you raise your hand. You will have approximately 2 minutes to raise your question or make your comment. We'll then give our speaker a chance to respond if he wishes to do so. And we encourage people to speak up, be respectful, raise good questions and comments, and let's take it from there. So let me go ahead and let's see. Let me go ahead and open the participants window to see what we've got going. here. And I'll give people a chance to raise their hands. I'll start off, and I'd like to actually raise a question or make a quick comment about the presentation. Something I've been really thinking about lately really pertains to your presentation, Michael, which is the real hole that we're in. A hole is really not even a good way to describe it. The situation that we're in with COVID and the environmental crisis and the heightening danger of war. And just speaking of the COVID crisis, it seems like it's been such a terrible bungle throughout the capitalist world that we really, some of the things that you talked about in terms of what Marx brought up, the need for us to take sort of collective control of society and put into effect cooperative social solutions to these problems is really the challenge today that we're facing. I think that this is really the challenge that you're talking about. The thing that I would call our attention to is in places like Russia and China in the past, the conditions that people were facing were so well, terrible. They were really, primitive economic development, the unrelenting hostility of imperialism, that many of the way that history developed in the 20th century was really so shaped by those conditions that it's important for us to kind of get that straight. So if you want to comment on that, and then we'll go to the participants. And I didn't see how people put their hands up, so I'll take it with Yusuf, Sharon, and Raj after that. But why don't you go ahead, Mike, and if you wish to comment.
Well, I agree with you. I mean, I think that what happened in China and happened in Russia was a drive to industrialize. I think most of the world was at least 150 years ahead of Russia and China. They had to sort of find a way of ensuring that they could compete on the world stage, and they saw imperialism and the aristocracy as something that was holding them back from that process. So, in a sense, it was, and I've used this phrase before, but it was their method of doing it was the same dish but different recipe. That they went for industrialization based on sort of state investment as opposed to the smaller investments of numerous capitalists developing the free market and then creating the industrial system. So I agree. I think they had a big challenge, and I think in fairness to people like Lenin and others, I mean they really had little choice but to do things the way that they did. I mean, it isn't necessarily right to kind of congratulate them for what they achieved, but on the other hand, some understanding of why they had to do it the way that they did, I think, is important. And I think it's important for all of us who are interested in politics to sort of have that level of insight and understanding as to why things have evolved in different parts of the world in different ways. Certainly, Marx would have encouraged that view. I think the idea that every country is determined by different material characteristics.
Okay, I'm going to call on Yusuf, Sharon, Raj, and then Jean, and you need to unmute yourself when we can't unmute you. You have to unmute yourself when it's time for you to make your comment or question. So Yusuf, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, thank you. Partly, Alan asked what I want to say. Also, I mean, Lenin, in the beginning, the slogan was all power to the Soviets. It wasn't all power to the Communist Party. There were other left parties, and I think Lenin was quite generous. He gave them leeway until things really got out of hand. And Noam Chomsky, who is a self-described libertarian, acknowledged this of Lenin, and also Mao. He realized that the importance of raising consciousness, and that was partly what was behind the Cultural Revolution. Mistakes were made; it didn't go exactly as planned, and but that's a different conversation. But I mean, these people realized these factors, and I think one has to appreciate that.
Yeah, I think all power to the Soviets when it was being used by Lenin. He was a very powerful orator, and I think it's comments made about the fact he could carry a crowd with him. He beat the idea into the public until he almost lost the will to live, and supported him. But all power to the Soviets was a kind of grassroots idea. The idea that the Soviets would be responsible for sort of running the state through various organizations, workers' councils, trade unions, etc. But of course, once they got into power, once Lenin was in power, those ideas went straight out of the window. In fact, I've got a very interesting book here, which I found at Keele University, and it's by a guy called Brinton. And I don't think you probably can't get this book anymore, but it details the period between 1917 and 1921, and how Lenin failed to deliver on all the promises that he made, both in his written works and in the promises that he made, just prior to the revolution. But the economic reality was, they just had to do what they did. I mean, they were trying to industrialize very, very quickly. It doesn't justify the sort of the mass slaughter that occurred with Stalin's collectivization of the farms. But you can understand what they were trying to do. They needed to get food to put on the table of the industrial workers. We'd had to do the same sort of thing in the West, just we did it in a different way.
Okay, next is Sharon, followed by Raj, Jean, Richard, and then Norma. Sharon, unmute
Thank you.
yourself.
Well, you lost me when you said that the Russian and Chinese workers did not benefit from the revolutions in those countries and that those revolutions were not Marxist. I really disagree. The Chinese Revolution was waged during the time of 10 years of brutal, horrible, unspeakable occupation by the Japanese, and the people of China, the working class and peasants, fought back under the leadership of the Communist Party, which was a disciplined cadre organization. And that's what Lenin taught us, that in order to have a revolution, you need a disciplined cadre organization. Of course, the Chinese people have benefited despite the mistakes that were made along the way, and they were grave mistakes. But I think that many people in the West have no appreciation of what it means to say that they have now, as of today, brought 500 million people out of poverty. People don't understand what that means for the vast masses of Chinese people who have been living in poverty. And finally, I want to say that the question of artificial intelligence, which is emerging in the 21st century, and what it will mean will depend on who's in power. So I think it's very right to be worried about that, taking away our jobs and reducing more people to poverty in the capitalist countries. But in China, what it's going to mean is that people the majority or the vast masses of workers will be able to work less for the same or better standard of living. That's because the Communist Party is in power in that country. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, just a couple of things. I describe them as not being Marxist revolutions, because Marxist revolutions don't require the vanguard. The notion of a vanguard or a cadre is a Leninist idea. The idea that this professional revolutionaries lead the people But the problem is that most people who've experienced those kind of revolutions suddenly find themselves being very much on the back foot when the state actually assumes absolute control. And that's certainly true in Russia, and it was certainly true in China. It's really whether or not, I guess for me, of course, feeding people is very important. So you're absolutely right. I mean, the drive to industrialize did result in people being given jobs and people being fed. But the fact is they hadn't experienced the kind of freedom that a mature capitalist system would have gifted to them before their revolution took place. My argument is that in the West, we have reached that point of mature capitalism. We now have the opportunity to recognise the benefits of contract choice consent, the freedoms that we enjoy, and we can push ahead and improve our political and economic lot now in a way that I don't think it's possible for people in China to do. I think that the fact that the Chinese Communist Party, well, it's not a communist party, it's just an autocracy. They're just autocrats. They just bully their people. I mean, it's a sad state of affairs, because I think that basically the way that they interpret Marx is that the surplus value that's created by the worker is basically managed by the state on behalf of the working class. That's how they kind of get around that problem of inherent within Marxism as to what happens to the surplus value that's created by the working class. In capitalism, the bourgeoisie manage it, or the state steps in and takes it off the bourgeoisie in terms of socialism. But in communist China, it's all the gifted to the state, and the state manages it. So I don't think there's much freedom in China, and I think freedom's important.
Okay, next is Raj, followed by Jean, Richard, and then Norma. I encourage people to raise your hand if you have questions. So Raj, if you want to unmute and
I'm unmuted.
Yeah, you're unmuted. Okay.
Okay. Michael, thank you. Very interesting ideas that you've presented. And I agree with you on the fact that today workers are not attracted to Marxism.
Mm-hmm.
So that is definitely your, at least in the Western world, okay? And I think this is also true in India, from where I come from. I'm a US citizen, but I grew up in India and maintain connection with India. So that, I think you are definitely raising a very important issue. Why is Marxism falling on the wayside, when in fact it is a tool for workers to win the war for themselves? So I think you identified that. With that, I agree. But I think there are a number of things. I don't think I'll be able to do it in 2 minutes. So let me pick on the fundamental contradiction of capital is not between capital and workers. You know, they don't care, just like the kings didn't care about those they oppressed and exploited. The capitalists don't care. That's not a fundamental contradiction. Fundamental contradiction, in my understanding, and this is my understanding, is the internal contradiction of capital. As it develops, its ability to make profit is undermined the very mechanism of making greater profit for individual capitalists. So tendency for the profit rate to fall is the fundamental contradiction of capital. So I would like you to comment on that. And then the other thing is that Marx himself talks about dictatorship of the proletariat as an initial stage. And I've read Lenin sufficiently to the difficulty faced by him in Russia. And he said basically that, Russia is a backward country, but that's a problem also in the most advanced countries, that the working class consciousness normally remains the consciousness of the ruling class, which is the bourgeois consciousness. That certainly is true in the United States by and large. And even India, I see that, because they're able to communicate that to everybody through their mass media and other ways of doing it. So I think, dictatorship of the proletariat has to start with some kind of organization which actually, without that centralized organization of Lenin, I have not seen where a revolution succeeds. So historically, we've had 100-year process in which both Mao and Lenin-led revolutions succeeded because they had a party and cadre and all that. So my challenge to you is your ideas seem to me are closer to that of libertarian socialism. I think Yusuf mentioned Chomsky, although Chomsky is hostile to Marx, you're not. So there's a big difference there. So anyway, there are a lot of other comments, but other thing is, one before I go, I think you're being unfair to Stalin on the collectivization of agriculture. That was welcomed by peasants, and actually they became over enthused about it, and there were a lot of unjust things done by the poor peasants upon middle peasants even. So I think some of them is kind of different historical understanding, but I appreciate what you have presented today. Thank you very much.
Do you want me to? I mean, do you want me to comment on that? I mean, I think
you want to go ahead.
I just think that we Marx offers for the mature Western world, the politically mature Western world, a Western world that's familiar with democracy, familiar with notions of consent and choice. All of these are kind of bourgeois ideas, but they were used very badly by the bourgeoisie to encourage unfairness, inequality, and elitism. And it's a case of really nailing down the inequality, unfairness, and elitism. That those principles are inherent within most societies, including China and including Russia. So really what we need to do is actually come together as ordinary working people and say, we want to maintain our freedom. We just don't want to be able to maintain our freedom in a way which encourages inequality and unfairness. So that's for me the fundamental point. I mean, yeah, we can have differences of opinion about the various contradictions. I mean, I do agree with you. The fact is that capital accumulation gets to the point where workers are laid off because there's just no. The instinct is just to continue to grow, and eventually capitalism outstrips itself and goes into paralysis. I would argue that we've reached that point now. And rather than sort of looking at ways of moving into something which better resembles a sort of a socialist or indeed even a nod towards something like communism or whatever, we're just using the adrenaline of debt to keep the old bourgeois structures in place, and that just seems to me to be absolutely appalling. We're basically bankrupt in the West. We're borrowing money to keep our bourgeois systems in existence.
Thank you.
Okay, next up is Jean, followed by Richard, followed by Norma, followed by Keith. So Jean, if you are unmuted, go ahead and ask your question.
I think I'm unmuted and visible.
You're ready.
Thank you very much, Mike, for this very provocative talk. And provocative, I enjoy talks that I disagree with probably more than those I agree with, because I learn more that way. But I would kind of echo some of the comments that both Sharon and Raj made about China and Stalin, both of whom I admire greatly. But, I live in Oakland. I'm fairly well off in terms of being a retired professor and not worried about things like a lot of things. But whenever I go to the market, I walk down Adelaide and there's still a string of unemployed people living in tents. And that's kind of one part of our society. And the other thing is, I've been to most of the socialist countries, not a long time, but when I was in Cuba, I remember we were there for a conference on the 150th anniversary of the publication of the Communist Manifesto. And one of the participants at one of our sessions, not me, but somebody said, well, how can you call yourself a democracy when you have only one party? And the response was, under Batista, we had 7 political parties and no democracy. Now we have one political party and we have democracy. And this goes back to what Lenin and Marx said about the Paris Commune, you know, that, well, before the Commune, they had regular elections in which they decided which representative of the ruling class was going to exploit them. But Commune had direct democracy. People directly chose their people and made sure, and they participated in all this. And I think if you look at both China, Cuba, and Stalin's Soviet Union, I think in each case, you'll find that there was a lot of public participation. And I think this is the case in each of those. And we've had some ongoing discussions of that, and I'm sure we'll touch on this again, but I just wanted to give my support to both comrades Raj and Sharon. And thank you very much for your talk, though. It's very provocative and worthwhile.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, I think it's important that people who come from a sort of a classical Marxist background do have the opportunity to sort of debate these things. I mean, you know, nothing's certain in this in politics, is it? We have to talk about these things and try and learn from one another. And there's not enough of these conversations, sensible conversations, taking place on the left, which is a real shame as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I just think in the manifesto, I can't find it at the moment. I've got it here, but in the manifesto, I think Marx does talk about the Communist Party actually being a collaborative party with other working class parties. He clearly suggests in the manifesto that there is a plurality of working class groups and working class parties. It isn't just one party, so yeah, I mean, there's different views on this, but I tend to take the view that plurality is better than, you know, one single monolithic party that organises, you know, through some kind of powerful structures of the state.
Okay, next up is Richard, followed by Norma, followed by Keith. And again, I would encourage people to raise your hand if you have questions or comments. We'll put you on the stack. So, Richard, if you would go ahead.
Hi there, Mike. Thank you for the presentation. I especially like the going back through the various Marxist publications. It took me back like 40, 50, 60 years ago when I was more up on this stuff. And I would love to. I would love to talk to you in terms of the, you know, the transition from a working class Marx to a financial based financial working class. Does that make sense? Anyway, yeah. Well, what really piqued my attention was your assertion that you talked about the Hanseatic or bourgeoisie.
Yeah.
And this is going to be one of my weird questions. So. The problem I had with that, I assume you were talking about the Hanseatic League, which for I don't know how many people know about the Hanseatic League, but it played a very important role in the European continent, and they were transnational. They were the first transnational political power. They offered terms to kings and queens and you know, but the problem I had, or the interest, is you called them bourgeoisie, and if I remember correctly, they weren't really bourgeoisie, although they did some manufacturing in the various cities, but instead they were basically mercantilists. They were merchants that were trading, and in that sense, I don't know how you call them really ruling class. I mean, it's true they had an association of city-states. So could you just elaborate a little bit on that, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think like I said throughout the presentation, I think that, you know, the principles of contract, choice, and consent fundamentally are the principles that undergird capitalism. Without contract, choice, consent, there is no such thing as capitalism. You know, you have to have that freedom. You have to have the ability to contract with people, to choose and to consent to things. So my understanding, this is my interpretation of the beginning of capitalism. It kind of began around about the 14th century, when the plague pushed up wage levels, and it enabled certain individuals to be removed from the strict sort of hierarchy that was imposed by the feudal system. And those individuals, a bit like Dick Whittington, you know, they kind of came freemen. They were able to sort of move out of their home area. They were able to trade. They were able to come, as you say, become merchants. That they had the fundamentals of those basic capitalist principles. They weren't a bourgeoisie as such. They didn't. They were still operating in this sort of the tail end, the fag end of the feudal system, if you like. But the principles that they were using in their day-to-day trading activities were essentially the principles that went on to underpin the bourgeois state. That's my interpretation of it.
Okay, next up is Norma.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. On that, I've just reversed the order of my comments. A child, a 14-year-old, was speaking to us in favor of some general thing, whatever she said, and she referred to the free compulsory public education. That's the degree to which we have contract rights. We don't have contract rights. We are given what we have to be assigned to, and we are lied to as being told that those are choice. I saw you nod your head, yes, thank you. And I hope that people get it. Our big job about speaking with our neighbors and all is to enable people to grasp together, to see us coming together over our opposition to our ownership by our owners, that we don't have choice and we don't like the things that are told to us as being choice. Along with that, the Soviet Union didn't have any choice about what to do. The survival of the revolution depended on what are called or made to appear to be the extremes enforced by Stalin. And, you know, it wasn't just Stalin, enforced by the people. The people were fantastically united, according to the stuff I've been reading. They supported things like the, what do you call it? The uniting of the farms and
collectivization.
Thank you. And that those were able to begin to feed the people for the first time, basically in their history. The starvation was the usual thing that went on. And the Soviet Union became under attack, military attack, as soon as it established anything like what was attempted to become the communist revolution or the socialist revolution. The constant invasions, you know about them, and punctuated by World War II. World War II. People had to survive World War II. There's no way to establish the political objectives under such an assault that was endless, basically, and especially continued after the peace treaties were signed. The Western powers continued their attack on the Bolshevik Revolution, as described by Anna Louise Strong so well. I see you, I have a note here that says something that made me comment that China forces all the people to have running water in their homes. That's a terrible, terrible thing for communist effort to do. I agree. The communist revolution needs organization. It's the thing we lack. And it's going to be based on us being capable of identifying what's going on with people, appealing, talking to people and saying, listen, World War II was an attempt to take back the effort by the people in Russia to provide themselves comfort, and then describe it in a way which is a loving way, a way that people next to you are going to say, well, yes, and allow that the struggle to normalize, socialism is a very simple kind of operation. You make everything and you give it all. Everybody makes it all and everybody gives it all to everybody. Capitalism is based on we make it all, and then our owners' system, that is, they own the governance, obliges us to allow our owners, the profiteers, to make profit. And that's a lot of paperwork, a lot of lies that are told and distortions and all in order to convince us that we are getting democracy by having these representatives. And last comment is this thing about school. Until even Cuba, which of course I venerate along with all of us, even Cuba, people have got to stop driving children, taking the children away from their homes by force, by laws, and saying, you have to go to school. There are ways to integrate the youngest, the 3-year-old, the 90-year-old into society in such a way that everybody is productive, and all of it teaches people. Everything in it is a teaching process, a learning process, and that nobody, I still mark that I am a teacher, although I have never been really employed. Well, I was employed as a teacher, but what a joke that was. That to recognize the place of school, and that why people say, well, the school does look like a prison, and the people who build the prisons, the schools, are the same people. The contractors build the schools and the prisons, and they look at. They're just beginning now to start taking the playgrounds as parks instead of those sterile environments that the children get put out for 10 minutes. A very unkind arrangement, and the parents don't like it, but they're not allowed to say, I hate public school, or just not just public. I hate.
Norma, let's give Michael a chance to respond, and we have some other questioners.
Yeah. I just think that, it's like all these discussions. We want to try and get people politically engaged, and we want to get people politically motivated and interested in doing something about the very issues that you're describing there. Unhappiness about the way they feel that their children are being indoctrinated, or whatever it might be. The pressure to just accept the kind of the sort of the fag end of the capitalist hegemony, if you like. The capitalist system is pretty much on its knees in the West, and it's being, as I say, kept alive with debt. And people are paying for that. And people's children are paying for it, and their children's children are paying for it. And where's it all going to end? It's just enabling the elite class to continue to sort of self-promote and look after their own interests at the expense of ordinary people. But we have to have political maturity. We have to have people who understand that freedom and opportunity and choice and consent are absolutely fundamental to the Western way of life. And so while I accept everything people have said about China in particular, China is not a free country. You can manage your way through the party system, through the Chinese Communist Party system if you want to, and you may get a preferential position. It was the same with Russia. When I've got a colleague here I work with in Boston, he's a Russian, and he said that that when the Bolsheviks would always make sure that their children went to the best schools, and it's just another example of where you use the power that you've got to look after your own interests. Everybody does it, but that is the fundamental problem with everything to do with our human condition, if you like. Everybody is still using whatever means they can to promote their own self-interest, and until we stop doing that, we're never going to move beyond a situation of unfairness.
It's the social structure that does it. It's not the nature of people that does it.
No, I agree with you entirely. I think I make the point earlier on, what's considered normal, greed, everyone's got their nose in the trough. That isn't normal. in normality is working collaboratively together to try and benefit ourselves as a community, not to sort of try and have a dog-eat-dog relationship with everybody else. But you see that dog-eat-dog relationship in every society, including in China. The difference between China and America or Britain is that they're a wealthier country than we are, and they can spend more money on their people than we can, but they are not a free society.
Okay, next up is Keith, followed by Raj. And again, I'd encourage people to raise your hand if you have any questions, comments. So Keith, if you would ask your question, go right ahead.
All right. Okay. Well, what type of organization do you envision to bring about the changes you wish to have this socialist revolution, whether it's peaceful or not so peaceful? How would you ensure at least a baseline of agreement amongst the people who would be organizing for that goal? And let's see, I had another one, but it just slipped my mind for a second.
Yeah,
well, just those two would be enough for now.
You can respond.
Yeah, all right.
Mike,
Well,
why don't you respond to those? And Keith, you can ask your
that's a really good point. I mean, I guess when I was talking about Blue Revolution, it sort of sounds a bit wishy-washy and a bit sort of, you know, bit like pablum, you know, a bit watery. But the reality is that you can't have. I mean, I've moved to the point where I don't think powerful parties, powerful vanguards, you know, actually deliver anything on behalf of working people. You've got to energize working people and bring them into politics so that they can use their collective experience of being at that level of society where they're anxious about their children, they're anxious about their jobs, they're anxious about paying the mortgage, you know, they're anxious about how they're going to put food on the table. You know, there is a growing number of people right across the West who fall into that category, and they're all politically mature. They all understand the principles of contract, choice, consent, and they all understand the notion of democracy. I don't think it's difficult, and this is my opinion, I don't think it's difficult to imagine a situation where the penny drops and people suddenly have this veil of accepting inequality, elitism, and unfairness raised, and they can suddenly see just the naked exploitation that's going on within our Western societies, all built into our Western political systems, all of which are sort of failing to deliver on our behalf. So in answer to your question, I think it's possible to do it by raising people's consciousness, and that's why I think it's really important that we get the word out there about Marxism. Marx talks about raised consciousness and class consciousness. We need to unite the left and unite the working class right, who are just as frightened as everybody else about the uncertainties that they're facing. They just want to deal with it in a different way. They go for QAnon rather than going into something like, you know, the organisation that you're involved with. You know, they're just working people who are scared. And the baseline agreement is they all have pretty much the same experience of life. They still have the same experience of uncertainty and fear.
Okay, next is Raj.
Yeah, Michael, thanks, Alan. Michael, I think you're quite correct, in my opinion, to criticize what happened once the socialist systems were established over a period of time, how they changed. Now, I don't think I'll agree with you that they started out that way, but I think your point is that whether they started out that way or not, they became a system of elite controlling everybody else. I think that's a valid criticism. I think that's an unsolved problem of the movement, is how to keep it democratic and so that workers actually participate. Yeah. And that difficulty, I think, is you honestly confront, and I think if you're honest, we have to confront that. Now, I will tell you, in '78, I was working in an office which was designing U.S. embassy in Soviet Union. And so they sent out from Moscow the guy who was in charge of the building department of Moscow, and he lived among us and he worked among us, you know, in Berkeley. He lived Berkeley, worked in San Francisco. He and I enjoyed lunch together and conversation. And I asked him, who gets the priority to go to college? He said, well, that's the problem. In the Soviet Union, the priority is given to the poor workers' children. They don't care about whether they have intelligence to go to college or not. And you're telling me the other way. So things change. I think they became, even in the 70s, I think the corruption there starts with Khrushchev, which he yields to capitalist mechanism in the production and distribution. So I think the point, and in China, the Communist Party seems to be taking some steps to return towards the idea of socialism, of equality, but how far it will go remains to be seen. It could be just, maybe just partial one. So I think the point you raised is very significant, but the other point that somebody else raises is the organization point. Now, the third point, if I may continue, just one other thing, is that Marx already talks about monopoly stage, right? In the third volume, he's talking about how monopoly rises out of workings of capital. That's where Lenin's greatest contribution, theoretically, is on imperialism, rise of imperialism. And the aspect of that is here that you're right. I agree with you, complete dysfunctionality of capitalism in the United States. They just keep on printing more money, and it's not going to solve the problem. So without understanding the mechanism of imperialism with which these newly liberated country from capital had to confront, we don't understand these societies, how they got themselves influenced by it. So I think there is a number of problems that we socialists have to, communists have to confront. And you're raising some important ones. So thank you, and please go ahead and comment as you choose.
Yeah, I think the reason that Marx talks about mature capitalism is that it's able to provide the resources to share amongst the people. So it needs to be an advanced capitalist system. It needs to be politically mature. So therefore, countries like Russia and China have a major disadvantage in that they haven't yet reached that level of political and economic maturity, which is why I think their revolutions tended to fall short of what Marx would have considered to be the ideal socialist or indeed latterly communist states. They didn't have contract choice consent because they'd never become social in character. Those economic principles that made capitalism work never took on a social character, never got embedded in everyone's mind, so that they would just accept these things as absolutely normal. So there had to be an element of authoritarianism exercised by the state to ensure it was capable of industrializing. So as I say, I think the revolutions that took place in China and Russia were revolutions about industrialization. Interesting. I'm just reminded, 1905, the revolution in 1905 was a bourgeois revolution in a sense, and there's a number of changes made to the Russian state. I think the Tsar sort of handed over some powers. I think there was free elections established, and I think capitalism was starting to become encouraged. And it was the growth of that very, very early capitalism that I think was stopped in its tracks by the 1917 revolution. And I can understand why Lenin and Trotsky and others didn't want to see Russia go down that route of capitalism, because they'd seen the consequences of capitalism when they were touring Europe, the starvation, the deprivation, the poor education, the poor health. But I do think, as you say, I think that it's important that as socialists acknowledge that you have to have socialism with freedom. It has to come with freedom. You can't have socialism with autocracy.
Okay, next up is Norma, followed by Jean, followed by Richard.
Right. The people change, Mike. I didn't express my an admiration of your presentation. I do admire what you did, what you said, and all the research and all the events about that. And there's a lot of worthy commentary in what you're saying, and reason for us to pay attention. Meantime, you got to go there and look, as my daughter once said, go there and get out and look around. The people are different. I just read an article, it's in Harper's. It ended with a person saying, and what is a salesman? Because the people, of course, in Russia they went out of their way to find out how to run capitalism, and then still haven't done it. You know, the opportunities got stolen out of their hands with the theft by the apparatchik of everything big. So a perfect practice of capitalism in the sense of how, but in the meantime, the people love the revolution. Putin, I have an article says Putin mourned the loss of the Soviet revolution. He said it was the greatest loss or crime or whatever of the 20th century, whatever he said. But he missed, I could post the link, I guess, in the chat about the reports in the popular newspapers. My West County newspaper took that article, an AP article, I guess, saying that Putin felt bad about the loss of the Soviet revolution. The people become a different outlooking people because of the revolution. And that thing about greed, it doesn't belong there. It goes to what I talk about being the withering of the way of the state, the people moving toward a unanimity of purpose, so that issues that come up are not a matter of saying, oh no, you're wrong. It's saying, oh golly, what can we do to work with that, you know, to resolve it and work it out so that people are all comfortable and not so that somebody's making profit, which is
I think, I mean, the notion of continuous revolution isn't continuous chaos. Essentially, continuous revolution is a kind of a not a debate as such, but the constant shift of the working class, challenging or dealing with new challenges as they arise, incorporating new scientific developments and all that sort of thing. The state withers away when the people have control over the state. I mean, for argument's sake, you know, would the people in our country or my country or your country tolerate high public sector salaries being paid to chief executives of local councils, for example? And we have a ludicrous situation in Boston where we have one of the smallest councils in the country. I think it's the second smallest council in the country, and our chief executive is paid something like £200,000 a year. I mean, no ordinary working person would tolerate those kind of salaries.
Standard.
Yeah, nobody
That's standard pay.
Yeah, but it's wrong. It's just fundamentally wrong. And I mean, you know, the country's being bankrupted to pay these salaries on essentially on the basis of a wages system. So the withering away of the state is the people having control over the state that assists in their, in their management, if you like.
Okay, next is Jean, followed by Richard, and we're getting close to the end here. And I'm going to ask Mike to do a short last comment before we end the Q&A. But in the meantime, let's have Jean and then Richard. So Jean, if you would unmute yourself.
Yeah, now I'm unmuted, hopefully. But yeah, I wanted to go at a somewhat different angle because I think it's important to understand the reason why China and Russia needed dictatorships of the proletariat, because they're fighting a war against, they're being attacked by a more powerful enemy, the international bourgeoisie. And that's going on right now. I want to give, for example, look at the sources, No Cold War on China. It's an organization that's developed. But what they do is they challenge the massive disinformation that is promulgated about China. And we have to understand this not as an honest attempt to understand what's going on in China, but it's part of this information war, soft power, that is attacking China and spreading disinformation. And I think one has to understand this for what it is, not an attempt to understand China, but an attempt to deliberately misunderstand it. And I urge people to go to their website and various Chinese sources and a whole series of people on the left, peace people here in the United States, who have actually spent a lot of time in China to give a different perspective on these things. Because I think we're all have our minds being screwed with by the mainstream media and part of this war on China. And I think we need to recognize it for what it is. But take a look at that No Cold War on China and some of the sources in there, the Chow Collective and others. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know. I just think that China is an interesting country. We're absolutely in hock to the Chinese. I don't know who's winning this war, actually.
Okay, next is Richard, then Yusuf. Then I think we're going to end the Q&A after that, give Michael a chance for his last comments. But Richard, if you would raise your question, go right ahead.
Sure. I wanted to second Gene's opinion on that. And also I wanted to disagree with that we're all in hock to China. We're not. It's yeah. But the question I had was before this thing started, before this Zoom session started, I did go on your Blue Revolution site and I read your documents, and two things came to mind. One is how do you deal with people who just don't want to get involved? And the other question that I had is, while it's nice not to have a political party, the powerful are not going to let you get away with that. I mean, they're going to form political parties, and they're going to advance their interests. And I can't help but think that they would do a very good job of cutting you up. So I'm just, thank you.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. A couple of interesting comments you make there. Firstly, if you've read any of the pamphlets, you'd have seen that in the first one, which is the history of politics simplified, we had a number of words that we developed, detamorphosis and other bits and bobs like that. And we actually at one point got them onto Urban Dictionary, only to find that all of them were taken off Urban Dictionary. We could get absolutely no explanation as to why they were removed. When I stood in a parliamentary election, I wasn't given a platform by the BBC, who considered me to be too irrelevant to even bother with, even though I was standing, and I'm a local politician in this area. They wouldn't give me a platform alongside the other politicians from the main parties. So there's a real sense in which if you're coming in with new ideas, the system doesn't really want to give you any encouragement. And there's an element of sort of that being, again, sort of top-down management. That's about the top saying, well, we're not prepared to sort of invest in people who are coming in with new ideas, so we'll just sort of squash them out of the way. Even our local community radio station, if you go onto the Blue Revolution Facebook page, that you'll hear an interview with me on the local radio. Well, that was put onto the local radio website and then very swiftly removed, because somebody complained about it. So the point you make about the establishment is absolutely correct. You know, they don't like people coming in with new sensible ideas, because it's sort of, I don't know, maybe it's a threat to them. I don't know. I don't particularly think Blue Revolution's that threatening. But in relation to the other point you make, the fact is you can't deal with people who don't want to get involved. You know, there is a massive apathy vote in this country, and I think the same applies to your country as well. Massive apathy vote. No one's interested in politics anymore. But the reality is those people have a shared experience, whether they see themselves as being on the left or they see themselves as being on the right. And the important thing is to bring those people together, you know, using an ideology, if you like, that can actually speak to them all. And that's about being a working person at the bottom of a bottom society, where you've got top-down power structures that were established in the 18th century, still working in the interests of the elite. So it's a case of saying, things might be okay at the moment. In this country, it's very hard to make progress because we have a welfare state, we have pensions, we have no real problem. Nobody starves in this country. If you're quite rightly so, if you're a young woman with a baby, you get your housing benefit paid. You're probably on above the minimum wage. The people who are hardest off in this country are single people who are working for the minimum wage. So we have a very fair system in Britain. So we have a lot of people who are apathetic, but they're apathetic because the system seems to be working for them. If the system starts to fail, then I think they'll start to become more angry, and that's the point at which I believe something like Blue Revolution needs to sort of step in and give them an opportunity to get involved in politics, without becoming sucked into the existing system and framework of politics.
Yusuf, last question. Go right ahead. Unmute yourself.
Yes. Well, I think the phrase, first of all, dictatorship of the proletariat, just means the proletariat as the ruling class. In capitalist countries, there's a dictatorship of capitalism. In socialist countries, or even if they haven't achieved economic socialism or and not even communism, the ruling class is the workers. I don't think that is problematic. The leading role of the Communist Party. The Communist Party was, in theory, was supposed to provide guidance, and the Soviets a governance. So I think what happened, and the Comrade Wadi Halabi gave a good and detailed talk about what went wrong as a result of circumstances that the Communist Party had to take over, was sort of forced into taking over governance as well. So one must look at it from that perspective rather than saying, oh, well, these guys got it wrong. Well, anyway,
I don't think. I think you just got to contextualize it. You've got to look at the actually economic and social reality in those countries at the time, and maybe that explains why things turned out the way that they did.
Okay, Michael, if you would make if you wish, make some last comments.
Yeah, well, just to say thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you. It's been really interesting, and it's always good to speak to people who share sort of a similar outlook on politics. But yeah, I mean, I think what the point that I'm keen to make is that the ordinary working people, for one reason or another, feel disillusioned and alienated from political discourse. And it's important that we somehow re-engage them. And in my opinion, Marxism provides a perfect ideology to enable us to do that, because it does speak to them as working people. It puts working people at the forefront of political and social change. But we have to find the right narrative, because if we have a narrative which doesn't contain liberty and freedom, or we promote ideas which people have traditionally or typically come to associate with oppression, I think we're going to find it very hard to get to that point where we can achieve some form of long-term and sustained improvement in social justice. So it's really Blue Revolution's about saying to people, there's a different way of looking at things. And if you look at things in the way that we're trying to look at things within our group, you might feel both confident and comfortable about the fact that it's based on libertarian principles or liberty, but it's also about bringing about economic and social change for the betterment of ordinary working people.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. Really appreciate your presentation, your coming and spending the time with us. I want to also thank Raj for doing the back end work on this session. At this point, I think what we're going to do, and also like to thank the participants for your excellent questions and participation during the Q&A period.
Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Niebuhr Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses. Since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums, please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS Sunday, SUNDAY, at yahoo.com, and the name is Richard Fallenbaum. And checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Niebuhr Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me/npml. For information, write to npml at marxistlibr.org, and the website is marxistlibr.org.